My brother Steve and I were bursting with excitement as our car rolled into the entrance of Quo Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. This is going to be epic, I thought, glancing at Steve, who was grinning as wide as I was. We had planned this trip for months, dreaming of the huge fish we'd catch in the untouched wilderness. The park ranger at the gate handed us a map and pointed us towards the lakes where we could find the best fishing spots. "Be careful out there, boys. It's easy to get lost," he warned, giving us a serious look. We nodded, eager to get going, and drove down a narrow dirt road that disappeared into thick forests of towering pines and birch trees. We parked near a small dock where we rented a sturdy canoe. It was our vessel for the week, and we packed it with all our camping gear: tents, sleeping bags, fishing rods, and a cooler full of food. "Let's catch some monsters," Steve said, referring to the northern pike and lake trout we hoped to encounter. Paddling out from the shore, we felt like true adventurers. The water was so clear we could see the sandy bottom several feet below. Every lake we passed seemed more beautiful than the last, with crystal clear waters and perfect spots along the shore where we could camp at night. Each evening, we set up camp on a new lake's edge. The routine was simple: build a fire, cook the fish we caught, and talk about everything and nothing under the stars. I loved these moments, away from the buzz of city life, just Steve and me, and the sounds of the wilderness. But on the fourth night, something changed. We had found a particularly secluded spot to camp, a recommendation from the park ranger who mentioned it didn't get many visitors. It was breathtaking, with a view of the lake that mirrored the sky, making it hard to tell where the water ended and the heavens began. After a successful day of fishing, we sat by the fire, our bellies full and our spirits high. The fire crackled, and the gentle lapping of water against the shore was like music. Just as we started to relax, a strange sound sliced through the peaceful night air. It began as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but then it grew into a high-pitched screech that seemed almost metallic. The noise echoed off the surrounding trees, making it hard to tell where it was coming from. Steve and I locked eyes, each of us frozen in place. "What the heck was that?" Steve whispered, his voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "I don't know," I replied, my heart racing. We sat in silence, listening intently, but the sound didn't come again. After a while, we tried to laugh it off. "Maybe it's just some weird acoustics, or a plane in the distance," I suggested, not quite believing my own words. "Yeah, maybe," Steve agreed, though I could tell he was as spooked as I was. We went to bed uneasy that night, the mysterious sound still echoing in our minds. Little did we know, that was just the beginning of our eerie adventures in Quo Provincial Park. The next morning, Steve and I woke up with the sun barely peeking through the thick canopy of pine trees. We were both a bit quiet, thinking about the strange noise from last night, but we were also excited to explore a new part of the lake. We had heard from the park ranger that the fishing was particularly good where a small river flowed into the lake, and we were eager to see if we could catch some really big fish there. As we paddled through the mist that hovered over the lake like a soft blanket, I couldn't shake off the eerie feeling from last night's noise. The lake was calm and quiet, too quiet, and it made me feel like we were the only two people in the whole world. When we reached the mouth of the river, I noticed something weird in the water ahead of us. At first, I thought it was just a log floating, but as we got closer, it started to move. It wasn't a log at all. It was something big, really big. "What is that?" Steve asked, his voice trembling a bit. I didn't have an answer for him. The thing, whatever it was, suddenly dipped below the surface, leaving behind a trail of bubbles. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do next, but the thought of catching big fish lured us forward, despite our nerves. We paddled more cautiously now, our eyes scanning the water. We reached the river mouth and cast our lines, but something felt off. There were no signs of fish at all. No splashes, no ripples, nothing. It was as if the river was dead. Just when we were about to give up and paddle back, I felt a sudden tug on my line. "I got something!" I yelled, excited at first. But then, I realized it wasn't acting like any fish I'd ever caught. It was too heavy and wasn't fighting back the way fish do. It felt like I had hooked onto something solid, something big. "Cut the line!" Steve shouted. He must have sensed something was wrong too. But before I could react, whatever was on the line started pulling hard, dragging our canoe towards the middle of the river. Steve grabbed his paddle and tried to row us away from it, but it was no use. Suddenly, the creature burst out of the water right next to our canoe. I'll never forget what I saw. It was like a giant eel, but with a crocodile's head, dark green, almost black skin, and the most terrifying part, the eyes. Yellow and glowing, with slit pupils that seemed to look right into my soul. It lunged at our canoe, its jaws snapping close to Steve's arm. He yelped and swung his paddle at it, but it was like hitting a wall. The creature barely flinched. In a moment of panic, I remembered the knife attached to my belt. I grabbed it and cut the fishing line. The creature disappeared into the water, taking my rod and reel with it. Steve and I were left in the rocking canoe, hearts pounding and hands shaking. We didn't say a word as we paddled back to camp as fast as we could. We packed up everything in a hurry, not even stopping to eat. We just needed to get away from the water, away from the creature. We didn't stop until we reached the ranger station. We told the ranger we'd had an accident and lost some gear. But the real story, the one about the creature in the lake, we kept that to ourselves. Who would believe such a thing? It was one of those Fridays where everything seemed to take forever. I kept glancing at the clock at the diner where I work, watching the minutes tick by so slowly they might as well have been hours. But today was different from the usual grind. My boyfriend Alex and I were heading out on a hiking trip on the Appalachian Trail as soon as my shift ended. Alex had been an Eagle Scout and was always super prepared for these kinds of adventures, which made me feel a bit better about setting off so late in the day. "Are we still good to go?" I texted Alex during my last break. He replied instantly, "Everything's packed, just waiting on you." By the time I untied my apron and clocked out, it was already past 4 p.m. Alex was waiting for me in the parking lot, our gear neatly stacked in the back of his old Jeep. The moment I saw him, all the stress of the day began to melt away. We were really doing this, a whole weekend away from everything. "We should hurry up. We've got quite a hike before sunset," he said, helping me load my bag into the car. The drive to the trailhead was a blur of green as we passed through the outskirts of town and into more secluded areas. Alex talked about the route we'd take and what I could expect from the hike. Despite his reassurances and the excitement bubbling inside me, a nervous flutter remained in my stomach. It wasn't just the daunting physical challenge. It was spending a whole weekend so far from the comforts of civilization. We started our hike at about 5:30 p.m. The trail welcomed us with a steep incline that seemed to mock our heavy metal-framed backpacks. Each step was a reminder of how unaccustomed my body was to this kind of exertion. Alex, on the other hand, moved with a steady confidence that only years of scouting could give. "Remember, it's about the journey, not just the destination," Alex would say every time he noticed me struggling. His encouragement helped, but so did the breaks we took to admire the view. About an hour into the hike, the weather decided we were having it too easy. Dark clouds rolled in, and soon enough rain started pelting us relentlessly. Within minutes, we were soaked through, our packs growing heavier with every drop that clung to them. The trail turned slippery, the mud grasping at our boots with every step. As the sky turned a darker shade of gray, the surrounding forest took on an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of rain hitting the leaves and our labored breathing. The fog was thickening, swallowing the path ahead in a white mist. Our pace slowed even more, not just because of the slippery mud, but also because the visibility was getting worse by the minute. "We need to find a shelter," I shouted over the noise of the storm, my voice edged with a hint of panic. Alex nodded, pulling out a map from his waterproof bag. "There's one not too far from here. We can make it if we keep going." The promise of a dry place to rest gave me a new burst of energy. We trudged on, the weight of our packs forgotten in our urgency to escape the downpour. Every part of me was drenched, cold and aching, and I started to doubt if this trip was such a good idea after all. But just as I thought I couldn't take another step, Alex grabbed my hand and pointed through the fog. There it is! Ahead, barely visible, was the outline of a small, three-walled log cabin, a beacon of hope in the relentless storm. Relief washed over me, mixed with a sense of accomplishment. We had made it to the shelter. Little did I know, the real adventure was just about to begin. As we approached the shelter, a gust of wind whipped through the trees, making the branches creak ominously above us. I shivered, not just from the cold, but also from the sudden realization that we weren't alone. Light spilled from the open side of the cabin, and I could hear voices mingling with the crackle of a small fire. Relief mixed with a twinge of disappointment. I had secretly hoped Alex and I would have the place to ourselves. Stepping into the shelter, we were greeted by an older couple who looked like they had settled in quite comfortably. The woman, with her scraggly gray hair and thick circular glasses, gave us a broad, albeit toothy and somewhat unsettling smile. The man, a bit overweight with a friendly demeanor, waved us over. "Don't just stand there getting wetter. Come in," he boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Thanks," I muttered, glancing at Alex, who seemed as relieved as I was to get out of the rain. We set down our heavy backpacks with a thud and began peeling off our soaked jackets. The woman handed us a towel, which I gratefully accepted, drying off my face and arms. "I'm Maya," the woman said, her voice raspy, possibly from years of smoking. "And this is Joe. We decided on a spur-of-the-moment getaway, just like you, I presume." "Yeah, something like that," Alex replied, smiling politely. "I'm Alex, and this is my girlfriend, Emma." We exchanged a few more pleasantries, the kind you do when you're just trying to be nice, because you have to share a space. Joe offered us some of their warmed-up canned soup, which we hesitated but eventually accepted, not wanting to be rude. The warmth of the soup was comforting, even if the company was a bit odd. As the night progressed, the storm outside grew wilder. Maya and Joe seemed unfazed, occasionally taking swigs from a flask that Joe jokingly referred to as their water bottle. The conversation flowed from one topic to another, mostly driven by Joe's cheerful banter. Maya, however, had a more unsettling presence. Her laughter was too loud, her stares a bit too long, and her anecdotes drifted towards bizarre. At one point, Maya leaned closer to me, her breath smelling of alcohol. "So Emma, tell me a story. I love stories," she said, her eyes piercing into mine. I glanced at Alex, who was busy discussing something about hiking trails with Joe. Deciding to keep things light, I began recounting how Alex and I met during our first year in college. But as I spoke, Maya's expression changed. Her previous giddiness shifted to agitation. "Why would you say that?" she interrupted sharply. Confused, I paused. "Say what?" "You said we met online. Why would you say we met online?" she snapped, her tone accusing. I was taken aback, not understanding her reaction. I was talking about Alex and me, not... Before I could finish, she cut me off again. "What are you implying?" Her voice was rising, and Joe glanced over, his expression suddenly serious. Realizing the situation was spiraling, I tried to steer the conversation back to safer waters. "I meant no offense. Let's talk about something else. Maybe you could share one of your favorite stories, Maya." Maya's demeanor shifted as quickly as it had soured. She giggled, a bit too loudly. "Oh, I have stories, dear, but they're only for the brave." The rest of the evening passed in a haze of awkward exchanges and uneasy laughter. I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was something very wrong with Maya. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced on the walls of the shelter, I felt a growing sense of dread. What had started as a simple escape into nature was quickly turning into a night I'd rather forget. The night deepened, wrapping the shelter in a cloak of darkness punctuated only by the erratic flicker of our dying fire. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of tempest was brewing, one that had my heart pounding and my palms sweating. Maya's behavior had shifted from merely odd to downright terrifying. As the hours ticked by, Maya's mood swung wildly. One moment she was laughing at a joke Joe made. And the next, she was staring into space, her face twisted in confusion. The most unnerving part was when she suddenly turned to me, her eyes wide and intense. "What did you give me?" she hissed, her voice a sharp whisper that cut through the noise of the storm. I froze, my mind racing. Alex and I hadn't given her anything. Joe, who had been trying to calm her throughout her mood swings, looked equally alarmed. "It's just the beer, Maya. You're not used to it," Joe said in a soothing tone, trying to placate her. But Maya wasn't listening. She rose unsteadily to her feet, pointing an accusing finger at us. "What did he give me?" she demanded, her voice escalating into a shout. It echoed off the wooden walls of the shelter, making me flinch. Alex moved closer to me, his hand finding mine in the darkness, squeezing it reassuringly. But his touch did little to ease my fear. We were stuck in a remote shelter with a woman who seemed on the brink of a breakdown, or something worse. "I need to get out," Maya muttered, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Her movements were erratic, her shadow monstrous against the flickering light of the fire. Joe tried to guide her back to her sleeping bag, but she shrugged him off violently. Then, as suddenly as her outburst had begun, Maya collapsed onto her sleeping bag, her energy seemingly drained. Joe covered her with a blanket, his expression one of deep concern mixed with embarrassment. He mouthed an apology to us, his eyes weary. "I think it's best if we all try to get some rest," Joe suggested quietly, obviously trying to diffuse the tense atmosphere. Alex and I nodded, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. I lay back, listening to the sound of Maya's uneven breathing and the relentless patter of rain on the cabin's roof. Every creak and whisper of the wind sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Time passed slowly, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Then, in the darkness, Maya began to talk in her sleep. Her words were muffled at first, then grew louder and more frantic. She was repeating something over and over, but I couldn't make it out. It sounded like a plea or a warning. Unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere any longer, Alex whispered to me, "We should go, now." We quietly gathered our belongings, our movements swift but silent. As we tiptoed past Maya and Joe, Maya suddenly sat up. Her eyes found mine in the darkness, her gaze piercing and unsettling. But we didn't stop. We pushed through the shelter's entrance into the storm outside, the cold rain a welcome relief from the stifling tension inside. We hiked away from the shelter, putting as much distance as we could between us and whatever darkness had descended upon Maya. We set up our tent in a clearing far from the shelter, the sound of the rain a constant companion. I lay awake for the rest of the night, listening, waiting, wondering if we had really escaped, or if the night's terror would find us even here. Many years ago, my nephew and I embarked on a camping and fishing trip to Cumberland, Maryland, known for its serene landscapes and natural beauty. We decided to stay at a state campground on the Potomac River, anticipating a tranquil and enjoyable experience away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The campground was somewhat expensive, with campsites spread far apart, offering comfort and a bit of eerie seclusion. We chose the last campsite at the end of the campground, far away from the other campers, seeking a little bit of extra privacy. With its gentle flow, the Potomac River provided a soothing backdrop, and the forest surrounding us was alive with the sounds of nature. We spent the day setting up camp, enjoying the simplicity of pitching the tent, arranging our gear, and gathering firewood. The weather was perfect, with a light breeze rustling the leaves and the sun casting dappled shadows through the canopy. We fished along the riverbank, chatting casually and enjoying the companionship such trips offer. As dusk settled in, we lit a campfire. Its flickering flames cast a warm glow and a comforting circle of light in the encroaching darkness. The forest around us began to transition into night mode, with the sounds of birds gradually giving way to the calls of nocturnal creatures. Everything seemed normal, just the typical symphony of forest sounds. Then, Around 10 or 11 at night, something unexpected happened. We heard the sound of a woman singing in the woods. It was not a song with recognizable lyrics, but a hauntingly beautiful melody without words. The voice was clear, resonant, and carried through the trees, creating a mesmerizing and unsettling atmosphere. I glanced at my nephew, sitting across the fire from me, and saw that he was wide-eyed and tense. My dog, lying peacefully by the fire, suddenly sprang to his feet, ears perked up, and staring intently into the darkness, from where the sound seemed to emanate. His usual alertness to intruders or unusual activity made his reaction all the more concerning. "Did you hear that?" I asked my nephew, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, pale in the firelight, and responded, "I don't hear anything. I'm going to bed." His denial was unconvincing, given that he was only about 10 feet away from me and the singing was quite loud. He was clearly frightened, perhaps hoping it would disappear by ignoring it. The melody continued, weaving through the trees. While it sounded like it was coming from one direction, it had an eerie quality that made pinpointing its source very difficult. It was as if the voice was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Despite the unsettling nature of the sound, it did not feel threatening. There was no sense of malice, just a haunting beauty that was hard to describe. I suggested to my nephew that we take a flashlight and walk around to see if we could find the source of the singing, but he was adamant about staying put. The fear in his eyes was evident, and he quickly retreated into the tent, leaving me and the dog alone by the fire. For several minutes the melody continued. I just stood there, listening intently, my dog by my side, both of us staring into the inky blackness of the woods. The fire crackled softly, a comforting but fragile barrier between us and the unknown. Then, as suddenly as it started, the singing just stopped. The forest was incredibly silent again, except for the occasional leaves rustling in the breeze. I felt a mixture of relief and curiosity. There was no way someone could have been hiding in the woods without my dog detecting them earlier. His calm yet alert demeanor suggested that whatever it was, it did not pose an imminent threat, but it was definitely out of the ordinary. The following day, my nephew and I discussed it a little more. He finally admitted to hearing the singing but was too scared to acknowledge it. We tried to rationalize what we had experienced, considering the possibility of an echo, animals, or even just other campers. But nothing really seemed to fit the situation perfectly. In the following days, I searched for similar experiences online in the Cumberland area, but never really found anything conclusive. Our encounter has remained a mystery, a peculiar and unforgettable chapter in our camping adventures. The memory of that night lingered as a reminder of the many unexplained phenomena that occur in the depths of nature.